Hello everyone. So I'm super rusty at the moment with filming in front of the camera and having full sentences to say. Over the last couple weeks I've been slowly starting to gather footage of something that I might compile together into a video at a later time. But the point of all that is really that I'm rusty right now. Also, my camera is doing something that it does from time to time that I don't really have an answer for. So this is already like my fourth or fifth time trying to start this video, so hopefully I'll actually get this going and be able to do this without losing my mind and having a meltdown. So, with that lovely introduction, today I want to do a sort of VR to Mixer's video and to Mary Grace Farren. The videos they made, to which I am kind of VRing, responding to, are their submissions for the 54321 tarot tag. I will not be doing the tag myself, mainly because at the moment, in case you can't tell, I'm experiencing a lot of neurodivergent autistic overwhelm. So whenever I'm talking about anything that isn't like the very specific, wheedly, nerdy little detail about the thing that I want to be talking about, I'm a ditz. Like in all other scenarios at the moment, I'm totally airheaded, I forget what I'm saying, I'm not even great about my favorite topics at the moment. So really nobody on the internet needs that right now. I don't have a whole lot to say about anything other than like specifically my little wonky things I want to say. So apologies that I guess that I'm not doing the tag, but this is in some ways an acknowledgement of Grace's tagging me, because I really appreciated that. But also very specifically in that video and in Stephanie's video, there were actually things that helped click something together for me. The thing that they helped click together was a video concept or idea that I've been mulling over for some months now. And I just didn't feel that I had something quite, that I was quite able to articulate what I had in mind until comparatively recently. I tend to let these things percolate until they can actually come out of my mouth. And that in some ways is a good segue into the actual topic. The topic, ostensibly, is the clairs. Clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, claircognizance, and the other added ones. I'll name some of them now, just because I had to look it up to remember. Things like clairgustance, the ability to taste psychically, clairaudience or clairolfaction, smell psychically. Clairtangency is a little bit like psychometry apparently, gathering impressions by touching or holding an object. Clairkinesthesia, so physical sensations in the body and so on. These sorts of things. What I want to do with this video is pose a question to the audience of this video, whoever's watching, about how they feel sensory experience in its most literal physical form informs any abilities they feel they do or don't have, whether we call these psychic abilities, or for example in my case it's much more what I would call things like personal gnosis, personal knowing, which might, in some ways, some people might think that that comes close to something like claircognizance, but I'll get into that in a bit. But to whatever degree you feel you have a personal propensity for these sorts of things, whether we call them psychic abilities or not, I'm interested at the moment in terms of how we do or don't bring literal sensory experience into those things, and also how our propensities for certain types of sensory experiences feed into those abilities, and maybe at some point or other are why we chose them or why we identify so clearly with this or that ability. Do we have choice in those things? Are these things that, in addition to, I think, there is this understanding that one can hone one's Gnostic senses over time. One can, expand on them like a muscle in a way. But to what degree are these things formulated early, if, or at any point in life, if we realize we actually have an analogous sensory experience that's quite an important one for us, for example? To what degree do we feel that those sorts of things and how they affect our cognition are deeply formative. For example, if you have certain things that you experienced as a teen from a sensory perspective or from a cognitive perspective that you then linked into something sensory, to what degree does that maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the line influence something that you come to call something more psychic or more Gnostic or whatever you want to call it? So firstly, what I hope is kind of clear is that I'm not going to be talking in this video from the perspective of understanding myself as psychic, but I'm not going to be eschewing those perspectives either. The point I want to come from is a more neutral one in terms of what we believe the real mechanics are behind all of this, and the actual like belief structures behind these descriptive phenomena, these descriptive words for things we feel we experience or know or can access. That's kind of the platform off of which I like most of my channel to function, unless I'm like explicitly saying this is my personal view on this, this, and this. Part of the reason I tend to avoid that is actually because words around those sorts of things definitionally can be quite difficult for me to understand what other people mean when they say them. I'm quite specific about which words I like to use, and if I don't know how to use a word, I really don't like it when I catch myself using it, if you know what I mean. So until I have an understanding of what a lot more people mean with certain words, I tend not to want to accidentally talk where I don't know what I'm saying. I also want this question that I'm asking to kind of apply and appeal to a larger collective from different perspectives, because I'm genuinely curious about this. So why am I calling this a VR? Most obviously, I suppose it would be because in Mixtress's video, she was discussing the clairs, and she had a really fascinating method for breaking down components of her sensory experience. In the case of that video, as related to her tarot decks, but the implication was that it was broader as well. She had this really interesting way of breaking those things down in terms of sensory experience and then trying to relate that back in practical terms to how that affects her practice. In some cases, her acquisition decisions. In other cases, how she responds and relates to her decks, how that manifests in the space around her, in her home, in her life, contextually in general, how she then reads the decks, what effect the presence of things has on her when they're nearby, all of that kind of thing. It was a really, really interesting discussion. And I just found it really fascinating. It was a really useful way to sort of, as a thought experiment, start pinning down specific ways to kind of characterize things, to then turn around and say to yourself, does that work? Does that make sense? And then tweak it from there. And like all of that being a really interesting way to kind of explore what are my sensory experiences and how do they tie into my clair type experiences, or do they even? In Grace's video, one of the things I want to be also including into this discussion is, in particular, as far as what I was responding to in the video, was her very tactile sort of show and tell component about these sort of props or common tools in her witchcraft practice. And what I found particularly interesting was her emphasis on personally blended herbs for the use of smell, but also just letting them kind of be in the air, and the manner in which she related that directly to the spirit world. And the part that really grabbed my attention was how she switches that off. Because of course we often talk about using things like incenses or herb blends or whatever to be you know, agents that thin the veil somewhat, or that call presences in, or road openers, things like that. And yes, we also talk about, you know, in the most immediate terms that are coming to mind, like closing the circle type techniques. But what I really liked was just kind of how she sort of indicated that, like, okay, be gone, this is obliterated. And I found that intensity and that immediacy tied to something that was a physical prop that she had made along with olfactory senses, among other things, was a really interesting, much less like archingly metaphoric way of talking about something that resonated with me quite strongly. I tend to get tied up in my words quite a lot, whereas a lot of my personal experiences are actually a lot more just kind of like sensory thing, very immediate knowing. And I think that sort of her manner of talking about that captured that a bit better than I'm ever able to do on my own channel, at least in my opinion. So those are the two kind of things that I'm bringing into this discussion. I will be using a tarot deck while discussing this. I have it here, but I may also be putting cutaways occasionally on the screen of other cards to kind of show, from other decks, to show a little bit of like certain components of what I'm going to be talking about. Okay. So to start, I'm going to talk about perception and sensory experience. For parts of this section, I'm going to be talking very much from my own personal lived experience in a way that may or may not apply to other individuals, but I'm doing so with the intent to sort of demonstrate curiosity, to talk about when something occurs to you, how I follow it through, how I explore those things, to some extent or other, also the emotional response to that, or like other ideas and feelings that come into play. And all of that is meant to be illustrative. So it never needs to be, at least from my perspective, it should never need to be that anybody else feels they must do something similar. For example, so many of the things and the thing I'm going to talk about now is a visual thing, but for somebody else that may not be even remotely relevant. So just bear in mind as I talk about this, yes, it's going to be coming from a very personal, specific perspective, but what I'm hoping to achieve is something a bit more collective and or generally applicable than just the specifics of me, myself, and I, if that makes any sense. So recently I came across the term in a YouTube video, SciShow specifically, tetrachromacy. This term did not initially stand out to me. The video in question was one, I think, to do with like uncommon things about human sight or something like that. I don't really remember. The thing that grabbed my attention about the word tetrachromacy was the ensuing description they had, wherein they described what tetrachromacy is, and the way they described it, my initial response was, isn't that what the world looks like? Because I was ready for this to be, this was just one among many phenomena that they were describing. I was ready for this to sound really weird, and then it didn't, and that caught my attention. I started looking into it. I will link some resources below. There's not a lot known or understood about this at this time. There are very few totally perfectly confirmed functional tetrachromats in the world, which is not to say that there are few functional tetrachromats in the world. It's that things like DNA confirmation, like as in genetic confirmation, and then testing for the neurological functionally switched on ability to process this added thing is basically, like, I think concentrated in 2 research centers, one in the UK and one maybe in the US. And like all of 1 or 2 people have been able to go through, due to like physical proximity or opportunity, the full process of having this looked at. The research is quite young. There will be a link to a Newcastle University research group, at least, in the description. But in the simplest of terms, I also, by the way, did look up various scientific articles and read some of the current research on this, just to get an understanding and to kind of keep my feet on the ground about this sort of thing, because I know how snooty people can be about things like self-diagnostics and whatnot. So anyway, from my understanding, what tetrachromacy is basically that certain individuals who are in possession of 2 X chromosomes rather than an XY chromosome combination ends up with a genetic mutation such that the color cone patterns in the back of the eye, which are normally 3, actually end up being 4. So normal vision is called trichromacy. Color blindness, air quotes, is a form of where you have 2 cones in the eye or a reduced sensitivity in the 3rd cone. So you can be deuteranomalous and things like that. So color blindness is where there's only 2 cones, or the 3rd cone doesn't really function like it should, so your color differentiation in that color receptor is diminished. Trichromacy is considered the norm. Tetrachromacy means 4 cone receptors in the back of the eye. The way this manifests is through the double X chromosome feature, wherein one parent bestows upon the quote-unquote double X chromosome person a slightly wonkified, a very, very slightly different color receptor from the duplicate from the other X. There is a thing that's supposed to happen genetically where duplicate features get switched off, so you don't end up with lots of duplicate features genetically. But there are situations where that doesn't get switched off in this case, and what you end up with is your normal RGB style trichromacy cones, and then a fourth one, which, as far as I'm aware in the research, tends to skew in a slightly yellowy, more yellow-green kind of direction. Its sensitivity is more skewed that way. So what this does is it grants people the ability to differentiate between even more colors. That is not to say that there's a color that humans can see that like no one's ever heard of, kind of added colors. What it means is that things like color acuity, color intensity, distinguishing between different shades is effectively greatly heightened. So if we think about color perception between three key main points as being like a matrix where all of the possible intersections are where you get your different variegating shades of color. If you add a fourth point to that matrix, you get even more combinations of colors available to you. That is my really garbled explanation of what tetrachromacy is. The added thing about this, though, is that neurologically the brain needs to have its neural pathways set up such that even if it has a fourth cone, it then can process that information into what we call sight. So people can have this fourth cone, but not actually be able to, it's like a non-functional fourth cone. It's there, but it's not, the brain can't read it effectively, can't receive the message. So you can see why there would be barriers to people actually getting this confirmed. One of the ways in which a person finds that out, though, or at least becomes a more likely candidate, is the reason one inherits a slightly wonky X chromosome is that there are certain male relatives, so XY chromosomal relatives, either through the matrilineal line or from your father, where they may never have been identified as colorblind on any kind of school test or at the opticians, but effectively from a genetic standpoint and from a color differentiation standpoint, they are very, very slightly deuteranomalous. So, long story short, I looked into this. I read lots of articles. A lot of what the sensory experience of those who have been confirmed as tetrachromatic has been described as matches what I experience. Some of these things have to do, for example, will be like looking in people's faces, the shades and variegations of tone are really intense. Really, really vibrant and intense differences between colors, differentiations between colors can be heightened, I forget the scientific term, but can be heightened in scenarios where the lighting is somewhat dimmed. Things like twilight lighting or the growing light in the morning, golden hour, those kinds of things. Not an excessively like bright camera flash kind of lighting or bright midday kind of lighting, but rather those sort of in-betweeny places lighting wise. So in those scenarios, color perception is actually increased even further. Lots of things like this. There is actually an artist who is one of the confirmed functional tetrachromats. In theory, I actually found a research article asking this question as well. Like, if you're an artist who is tetrachromatic and you are working in color in your work, what does that mean about other people being able to perceive your work? This has an added layer of complication in the sense that all device screens only function from a 3-point color system with their pixelated features, so you can't actually express the subtlety that comes with tetrachromacy through any kind of device screen. So if you're someone who is tetrachromatic making art and you scan your art for digital production, you're not producing, in theory anyway, something that is as subtle as what you made, assuming you made it with the level of subtlety that somehow properly reflect. You get how it gets weird. There are a lot of questions, I think, also to be asked, incidentally, about the limitations of AI art as a primarily digital-born medium. There's also questions to be asked about AI art in terms of digital preservation from the archival standpoint, by the way, so that's a discussion for another time. But effectively, there is this artist who apparently is tetrachromatic. In theory, she paints such that it's meant to convey what tetrachromatic vision is like. And from the main paintings that seem to be shown on her site as like key examples of this, there's one of a tree and things like that. It's basically with one small detail being different. It's basically what my vision looks like. So I don't know if that's just normal or what. Again, I was viewing it through a screen as well, so I'm just really not sure how that translates. The scientific article I found that was asking about that was basically saying like, well, what does that mean? Like if you're a tetrachromat in a trichromatic world, what? So, basically, like I found out my dad is somewhat colorblind. We did a certain test, the one that is recommended by the Newcastle University group. It is of course not foolproof, and I have no current genetic proof or anything. I don't even know if I would ever seek it out because it's kind of a moot point. Because I still don't know what any of that would mean. I just know how I respond to visuals seems to be a bit different from pretty much everyone else I've ever encountered. The website itself specifies like, have you ever had debates about like why nothing ever matches, or do you have a great color memory? Like there's a list of like, if you tick all these boxes, you might be tetrachromatic, and if you live in the Newcastle area, get in touch with us. Basically any of those sorts of things that I came across in the official literature, I was like, yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. So this is and isn't a revelation in some ways. It doesn't really mean anything, but it does. I suppose from an emotional standpoint, it at least makes me feel a little less gaslit about why people find me irritating when I get excited about a visual experience in person sometimes, because I won't shut up. That's also possibly just the autism. And what I'm interested in as well is the way in which this impacts how we process information, what we end up caring about, because in theory, if this applies, or if even just from the autistic standpoint, I have a tendency to care about things very intensely in a highly honed in and really refusing to budge kind of way. There's any number of ways in which the given personality of a person might affect their sensory experience from young, or at any stage in their life, such that they feel their most magical, potent part of themselves manifest as one of the clairs, right? Would I call myself visually oriented in terms of, like, is that clairvoyance technically? Not really. Again, I come at things from a little bit more of a Gnosis standpoint. What would this also mean in terms of things like mental health, right? Because there was a stage in my life that I've indicated before where I was not in medical control of my body, very much against my will, and especially post certain revelations in a really damaging way. But in regaining my agency about that, I also noticed that my my awareness of color came flooding back in because I was neurologically rested such that I was no longer just constantly short-circuiting and not really living or being present and so on, right? So even things like recovering from a difficult experience and, say, using witchcraft or our spiritual practices to heal, if we take time to notice what sensory experiences start flooding in as a result of that, even if we never before felt that we had any kind of special acuity of any kind in a sort of a Gnostic or otherworldly or spiritual or energetic or psychic way, might that be a scenario in which that starts to really matter? And what are the sensory experiences that go into that? So what, for example, for me, does the astral or the Gnostic realm or do these bursts of knowing or feeling or seeing feel like? They're highly informed by quality of light and mood. They are also multimedia. I am not, for sure, I'm definitely not synesthetic. So I'm not someone who, say, hears music and also sees color as a result, you know, of certain combinations of sound. My sensory experiences are not literally neurologically crossed in that way. But if I listen to a song, especially one with a certain type of rhythm or narrative structure, I will end up visualizing things quite intensely with whole settings and sensory detail, which for me, I think is also influenced not only by things like storybooks and movies and things like that, but also by the fact that so much of historical art is doing the exact same thing. If we have, say, a 3/4 structure in a song, a waltz, let's say, and the waltz in question, the lyrics of the song are talking about a relationship between two individuals. A waltz is a dance between two individuals in a rhythm of 3, right? If we look at a painting where the predominant structure is a centered triangle in a portrait kind of orientation, a central triangle, and then we have 2 pillars between. In some ways, geometrically, we're looking at the same concept, right? I have made a video before talking about witchy aesthetics, in which I'll put them on screen. I basically talked about these 2 images, one by Jackson Pollock, one by Trina Sharp-Hyman, and kind of indicated that architecturally, compositionally, and also in some ways in terms of color and so on, and linear structure, they're achieving the same thing. I'll link to the video. The images will also just be on screen so you can kind of see what I'm referring to. So when I listen to music, it's quite immediate that I might think about certain visual associations, simply because over time I've been doing a lot of listening to music and a lot of looking at things. It's kind of the 2 things I enjoy doing the most, in addition to then crafting stuff, which I also often do to musical accompaniment. Furthermore, what that starts to enhance is something I've been working on articulating for myself this year, is a very architectural understanding of the spatial awareness of, say, my astral realm or my Gnostic impressions and so on. It starts to relate to things like numerology and the portrayal of space. The visual architecture of a card matters a lot to me. And then we also have color associations. There are very direct symbolic links to what certain colors mean in certain contexts. There's also generalized human responses to certain color. There's also color theory, which is part of how, in addition to things like line and composition and texture and so on, color theory is part of what governs the movement of your eye across an image and so on. So you can see already that the techniques that are inherent in making art or in reading art history, it's literally called reading, by the way, reading a painting or reading a cathedral, etc., etc. All of these techniques are already a whole skill set, a whole language that is actually quite long-winded to put into words, because what you're meant to be doing is being there and seeing it or hearing it and understanding without necessarily intervening with all the terminology that goes along with it. So I'm going to get the deck out now, but I'm also going to talk about some more concrete examples of what I've been talking about just in sort of general terms. Some of my sensory experiences, for example, if I'm walking through an apple grove at a time of day that has a certain quality of light, and I start playing in my head a historical tune, or even a modern one, about apples, and I look at the patterning of the leaves in the trees, and I hear the sound of the wind in the trees, and I start to notice certain latticed structures, or say I'm in a grove of birch trees or something like that, I'm going to start to draw musical associations with that. I'm going to start to hear those songs in my head. I'm going to start to make little sort of analogies around as I look. I'm always, by the way, it can be a bit distracting to walk with me, because I'm always kind of doing this as I walk, like always looking at things. But also I'm not always the best listener when walking, because I'll be looking and listening to something else. It's just in my ears. Not literally, like just in my head. And what we get, here's a card that I just drew. This is the 9 of Cups. So for example, if you were to look at this and start to see, we have a structure of 4 with an overarching 3 and then 2 at the top, right? And then we see that there are these circular patterns, which is a reused background in this deck, behind these curvilinear shapes of certain colors. And then on top of that, we have... Hello everyone, Editing Sorsha here to say that my camera cut out. So what I was saying was that on top of the blue and green of the background or underlayer, we have a patterning of flowers in cooler pinks and even some purple flowers in order to marry the divide between the background and the foreground. So the cooler pinks and purples link in color theory wise with the cool tones of the backdrop, the blues and the blue-greens. But they also register against that backdrop as a very warm color, even though they themselves, by themselves, are not the warmest of colors. And that's part of what helps the cups not be too jarring from a color theory and compositional perspective. Those flowers are carrying the burden of marrying the worlds or the layers of the card. So on with the discussion. But also really pops from the green behind. You know, what are some of the associations we might come up with that? Right off the top of my head, I might start to hear birdsong in particular. I might start to think about the sound of water flowing. Depending on the circumstance, I might picture a pond, which might seem more appropriate here, or a river, depending. I might then, as Tom Waite says, open the drawer of songs in my head that belongs to rivers or to lakes and ponds, or to certain types of fish or certain animals that I might see in this scenario. If I were out for a walk and drew a card, that would further inform what I'm starting to feel about these images. Now, if I were not out for a walk and I were just reading the cards in front of me, all of these associations would still be present, but I might not immediately articulate them in terms of words. It's very rare, for example, that I write down everything, every detail about my readings, because I'd be there for a very long time indeed. But each time I look at a set of images, there's going to be any number of a huge wealth of references and ideas and concepts that come flooding in. And that, in turn, is influenced by the cards around, all of which start to clamor and talk to each other. I'm using sound-based terminology here, words like clamor and talk, but it's not necessarily literally an audio experience in that way. I will put a photograph here of one of the cards from this deck because I don't want to necessarily go finding it right now. And a photograph I took earlier in the year where you will be able to see very direct, very overt and obvious visual similarities between the two. I did not have the deck with me when I was going on that particular walk, but I immediately saw the resemblance. And when I came home, I made sure to reinforce that information. Using the deck over time continues to reinforce that information. This deck in particular also suits this really well because we have an above and below ground component. At some point I will make a video talking about the book for this deck. Written by Picard, because he has some very, very strange and wonky perspectives about how tarot works. Some of it is absolute genius. Other bits of it are really quite interesting in that they seem to have been founded on an honest mistake that he then sort of launches from, seemingly not knowing that he's done it. It's a very strange read. So at some point I will discuss that. But here we have a sunrise above ground, and then in the case of this deck system, there's often larval associations underground that have, for Picard, very specific meanings. But the above and below ground component here is echoed. The symmetry between the two, or the relationship between the two architecturally, is echoed in the structure of the wands here, which is not always the case with these above and below ground images. This is also part of the reason that reversals work quite nicely for this deck. Another example of this sort of 3-2 structure that I've been talking about as manifests in tarot is with the Crystal Tarot's Three of Pentacles. Now, I've said before, this reminds me of the body of the goddess, right? I think that's a pretty clear analogy to make here, a pretty clear conceptual comparison to draw. However, I think it also manifests in other ways. We have the the divided into two kind of component here, the above ground and below ground. In this case, it is not symmetrical. And then structurally, it's severed across a three-pointed shape, a triangle. So we have the 3 and the 2 that I was kind of talking about, right? Now, conceptually, like visually, we have 3 and 2. Conceptually, we have the 3 that I at least associate with my deity figure. What do I feel conceptually might be the 2? Is it above and below, light and dark? Is it light and shadow? Or is it me and her? When I get this card, I often feel called to check in with her in the way that a person might feel called to do if they received the High Priestess, which is a 2, or the 2 of Cups, which is also a 2. For me, this 3 straddles the divide between those things, 1 foot on either side of the divide, as it were. There's an invitation to strengthen the foundation. Perhaps I'm the pentacle at the top and she's the 2 pentacles below. Perhaps it's time to go sit at the altar and check in and commune and find that 3-pointed plane that makes such a solid foundation. There's any number of ways in which you could see this, but basically I see this sort of thing as a call to conversation. She being the 3 and the representation of 2 being she and I and herself. I would then be further called to do certain things mentally and also at the altar in terms of if I were to do a ritual or spell working, I might pull from the colors in this card to achieve that. Or if I'm out and about somewhere going for a walk in nature or so on, if I see colors that evoke the memory of this card to me, I might also take that as my sign to come home and do the same things that I'm often inspired to do in receipt of this card. So you can kind of see that the more I use a certain deck or a certain system, or the more I start drawing analogies between certain shapes and so on, the tarot starts to talk to me, I talk to the world talks to me, I talk to the tarot talks to the world. All of these things start to reinforce themselves. The extent to which this becomes very difficult to put into words for YouTube to show the world, like, oh, what does my witchcraft look like? Let's seek some more detail. Let's actually dig deep, is I would have to explain all of that to then show some of the working components, say, of something like a spell or a ritual working. Now, obviously I've done that in a way just now, and certainly we also like to guard our privacy online and not explain literally everything, but don't worry, I never could anyway. I'm not sure you can either. So the point though here is to give, again, an illustrative example of the ways in which these sensory details might work on the mind without literally looking at the card and saying 3 pentacles equals this book meaning. Book meanings absolutely formulate a part of that understanding. It is a key part of that foundation, but this is also what I guess we mean when we say use your intuition and go further than that. Bring who you are to bear on your ability to read tarot and your propensities, your skill sets, your things you're naturally just really drawn to and good at. That kind of stuff needs to be built into how you read the tarot, how you do your workings and so on. And that's also what makes it so perfectly magically potent, especially for someone like me, because depending on the day I can have an extremely difficult time focusing. I'm much more likely to get excited and actually like laser focus if you get me to care about the color red than if you just tell me to focus and like direct my intent. I don't always know what that means, but I know what it means to get really, really gung-ho about the shape of a rose and or larval structure inside a triangle or a pentagram shaped thing encased by 3 golden pentacles. Like that lights my brain on fire, you know? Fire in the head and so on. So that's just yet another example. There are lots. I will hopefully be putting more of these on screen. So another example using this deck, right? The video that I made previously about this deck where I talk about remembering certain experiences from when I was younger, I believe I was talking about the wand suit at the time. I mentioned seeing a video wherein someone was standing in a wood cabin in the woods. They turn and step and shift, and that made me cry. And it's because visually I could see the color in the room, the quality of light. I could hear from his turn and step the size of the room around him in addition to being able to see it. And the camera's cut out again, so editing Sorsha here to say that what I was saying was in the other video, I had a really intense emotional experience because the sensory detail included in that video involving a wooden cabin evoked the memories of what it was to live in wooden structures that talk to you throughout the day rather than predominantly Irish architecture, which is not wood-based, it's often stone and or cement, etc. Again, video will be linked. Well, but that's an example of the beginnings of what I start to feel are a sort of a clairvoyant or clairsentient or claircognizant experience, but also a Gnostic experience. It's not quite what Gnosis or actually visiting the astral feels like. That is, yet again, even a bit stronger and a bit more intense and a bit more distinctive, but it starts to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Or I hope it does anyway. Some other examples of how we might have color associations with things. You know, if, for example, you were ever to see me wearing a blue stocking, literally, I'd be making a reference to blue stockings. I'd be identifying as a blue stocking. Furthermore, if, for example, with my clothing today, I'm choosing certain colors, and I'm also utilizing what I've been thinking of as like iterative silhouettes that reappear throughout certain specific times in history. So I will stand up and show just very briefly. This top is technically a thrift flip. It's a top from the 90s. It was massively oversized for me when I got it recently. So I stitched it so that it would fit. And I sewed on my own buttons. And I adjusted the buttonholes so that it would actually fit. And effectively what I'm doing is saying 17th century by way of the 1880s. But I'm not saying that. I'm being or showing that through color and through shape and so on. 17th century by way of the 1880s by way of the 1990s. So to return to my question, right? All of these sorts of things can be described as simple sensory experiences. Very, very distinctive experiences of color, potentially highly formative ones, and especially in the sense that I've always just been treated and talked to in a certain way and always kind of understood that I assumed that my sight was exactly the same as everybody else's when it might not be, maybe, potentially, and the emotional effect that may or may not have on a person who then really stubbornly heads in the direction lifelong of like being obsessed with art and color and visuals. Sensory experiences in terms of air quality, in terms of sound and music or texture, fabric, combining fabric with color, going for a walk and seeing the scintillation of trees and the effect of light and hearing a song and then needing to go somewhere sacred in your mind, not only to actually mitigate the intensity of the experience, but to then synthesize it and learn something and commune, in my case very frequently with deity. These are all the sensory components, and I would love to hear, again, the question is, what do you all think about the ways in which these do or don't influence each other? The last part I'll just say is that exploring this through tarot, as with the Crystal Tarot, which is the tarot deck that I always have with me in my bag at all times. It is my travel deck. I keep it in a bag. If it gets dinged up, all the better. I have the Crystal Tarot with me at all times, but, you know, one does not have to be out and about, for example, to explore this, obviously. Not all of us do our readings out and about. Not all of us even use tarot. But, for example, I have been exploring this through tarot, but also then applying this with tarot, because it starts to make me ask more and more questions. Is it just art history that makes me love certain decks the way I do, or is it something more? Is it just image composition, or is it just my favorite colors, or my own personal color associations, or, you know, what is the thing that draws me into certain ways of understanding things, and what else might I be able to find and see? So I will, for example, show on screen some photographs I took. some of the photographs will be of the Halloween Tarot by Kipling West. Some of the photographs will be of the Crow Tarot by M.J. Cullinane. Now, a quick word of disclaimer. I personally am not a fan of the Crow Tarot by M.J. Cullinane. I do own it, which is how I was able to take the photographs. I have mentioned it in my videos before. I worked quite hard for a really long time to get along with the deck. I have another M.J. Cullinane deck that I do really love. This deck in particular, though, for me specifically, has always really, really frustrated me. And I had some theories as to why, and I recently tested them for myself. That's what this segment of the video is about. It is in no way to denigrate anyone else's love and appreciation for that deck, and it is certainly in no way meant to be a criticism of M.J. Cullinane herself or her art. It's not relevant really, the deck specifically. It's me asking myself questions about sensory experience. What I did basically was I realized that one of the issues I had, in addition to a sensation that the Crow Tarot felt for me quite crowded and muddy, I had this growing sensation that actually what was going on was an issue of color, of the value of the colors in the deck. What I mean by value is the art, like color theory and art term value, which is between hue, tone, and value. Value is the level or amount of gray in a color. So you can have a primary red and you change the quality of that red color by adding gray tones to it, or taking away if it's an already quite grayed out red. It's not quite the same as things like opacity and so on, basically. It's very specifically value, gray. So what I did was, since I actually noticed that there are certain color combinations that tend to irritate me, very specifically certain value questionable reds, crimsons with value questionable teals, I was like, okay, the Halloween Tarot also has some, in some cases, some of those color combinations that usually tend to irritate me, but they don't irritate me in the Halloween Tarot. Why would that be? And again, I was thinking, I think it has to do with value, color value. So I took some photographs of cards from each of the decks, and then I basically completely grayscaled them. To give both decks the benefit of the doubt, I heightened the sharpness slightly with the original color photograph. I will put those on screen just as an example. And I think what you will see is that, with one slight caveat, because I will say that the Halloween Tarot, I've been mentioning this to a couple people because I recently acquired it and I never realized it was as subtle as it was. Because when you see it on screens, it never shows just how incredibly textured and sort of stippled and shimmering the shading is in it. There is so much color-based information in that deck that is extremely subtle and crystal clear when you're looking at it, that I feel is lost on screen. Anyway, I was expecting to like the Halloween Tarot when I purchased it, but I'm actually in love with it, so there is that. It is also, you know, largely speaking, vibrant tones against a black background. That does things to my brain that make me very happy, as I've mentioned many times here. But at any rate, I took some photos of the Halloween Tarot, took some photos of the Crow Tarot, grayed both of them out entirely, and looked comparatively at the images. And an image that handles its value in its color tones and arrangement correctly will not lose you any detail whatsoever if transferred into grayscale, other than very specifically color hue. You should still be able to read an image with all of its lights and darks and its structure and the subtleties of all that and all its texture and so on, tell the difference between foreground and background. If you've taken the color out, it should still function because your gray tones and things will also be part of how you plan out the image from an art technique kind of perspective. And I think that's borne out in comparing these two decks and just sort of showing, you know, what is the difference between taking the color out. I just personally found that a very interesting exercise, and for me it confirmed why I tend to struggle, one of the reasons anyway that I tend to struggle with the Crow Tarot, and why I've basically had to like put it aside and not ever use it anymore. So as you can see, out of all of this garbled mess of probably quite nonsensical things I've rattled off here, a lot of my own practice, both in terms of exploring the tarot and using the tarot, but also my own witchcraft, my own Gnostic experiences, my own religious sensibilities and experiences, my understanding of my spirituality, the way I talk to people around me, the way I move through the world, and then again, in turn, how that gets applied when I look back at the tarot, how that becomes relevant, how that isn't relevant, etc., is influenced very intensely by what I would call sensory-defined experiences. I don't know still which clair I would use, because I don't feel that clairvoyant is almost like seeing things that are not there. I don't know. Because I'm not exactly sitting still and then just coming up with things, except when I am. I don't know. So hopefully all of this gets tied together. The point is sensory experience. The point is psychic or Gnostic type experience or spiritual ideation and so on. And how we build these things, whether that's intentional, I see well, so I do this, I hear well, so I do this, my favorite thing is this sensory experience on my fingers, so I'm going to develop this or that skill, or whether it's more accidental. To what degree do you have any experience with this? What do you think, viewer? I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments. Again, as with so many of my videos, I've not necessarily come to any huge conclusions. I'm just really interested in how these things interact with one another. Lastly, I hope to kind of explore this a bit further ongoingly. I have more ideas about things I want to talk about with the Crystal Tarot, more in depth. I have other decks that I want to make videos about, questions I want to ask. I really enjoy kind of taking the tarot to task, as it were, by, like, you know, for example, as I did here with taking photographs and then manipulating the different components of the photographs to kind of almost explore, like X-ray style, what the structure is underneath it all and so on. But yeah, hopefully those of you who are in for being along with that ride can join me. But do bear in mind that not all of my videos are about tarot. I wouldn't call myself a tarot tuber in any sense of the word. Just doing whatever here. So hopefully everyone here finds something of value. And if not, I hope that I haven't wasted your time. Awkward. Okay, anyway, I hope everyone's doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!